The law says some men deserve to die. The good book says vengeance is the Lord's. But out here in the unforgiving dust of the territories, the only law that matters is survival. For Abigail Hayes, a widow with nothing left but a failing ranch and a son to protect survival, was a prayer whispered into the wind. That prayer was answered on the night of the blood-red storm, not by an angel, but by the devil himself. His name was Jedediah Stone, an outlaw with $1,000 bounty on his head and a bullet in his side. She made a choice that night to shelter the one man everyone wanted dead. She never imagined that one day he'd come back to claim the only thing she had left to give herself. The wind that howled across the plains of the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1883 carried with it the ghosts of promises. For Abigail Hayes, it mostly just carried dust. It settled in a fine red film on the pine table her husband Robert had built. It coated the worn cover of the family Bible. It found its way into the lines on her face, etched there not by age but by worry. She was 28, but felt 100. Robert had been gone a year, taken by a fever that had swept through Redemption Creek with the merciless efficiency of a brush fire. He had left her with a son, 10-year-old Thomas, a quarter section of land that was more rock than soil, and a mountain of debt to the town's land baron and banker, Silas Blackwood. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters sounded like his footsteps, his approach coming to collect what was his. Tonight, the wind was a banshee tearing at the small ranch house, as if trying to rip it from its very foundations. A storm was brewing the sky, a bruised and violent purple. Thomas was asleep in his small room, a merciful escape from the oppressive anxiety that choked the air. Abigail sat at the table, a cold cup of chicory coffee in her hands, watching the lantern flame dance and sputter. A sudden frantic pounding on the door made her jump, spilling the cold coffee over her chapped knuckles. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor. It was a desperate, primal drumming. Her heart leapt into her throat. It could be Blackwood's men come to post the foreclosure notice in the middle of the storm. Or worse. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice, a thin, reedy thing against the storm's fury. A man's voice, ragged and torn, answered from the other side. "Please, Mum, I need help." Abigail grabbed the old Greener shotgun from its hooks by the hearth. It had been Robert's. It was heavy, and she prayed she wouldn't have to use it. She crept to the door, peering through a small crack in the wood. All she could see was darkness, rain beginning to fall in thick, angry sheets. "Go on now. I've got nothing for you here," she shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. "They're after me." "Pinkertons?" The voice rasped, followed by a wet, racking cough. "I'm hit. Just for a while, till the storm passes." Pinkertons. The name sent a chill down her spine, colder than the coming rain. They were relentless agents hired by railroad magnates and banks. They didn't hunt cattle rustlers. They hunted men who robbed trains and killed with impunity. They hunted men like Jedediah Stone. His face had been plastered on posters in the marshal's office for months. Wanted dead or alive. Jedediah Stone. For train robbery and the murder of Deputy Franklin Potts. $1,000 reward. $1,000. It was a fortune. Enough to pay off Silas Blackwood, buy new seed, fix the barn roof, and live without the constant fear gnawing at her gut. For a fleeting, shameful moment, she considered opening the door, only to put the shotgun to his head and claim the bounty herself. But then came a low groan of pure, unadulterated pain from the other side, followed by the heavy slump of a body against the door. The sound broke through her fear and her desperate calculations. It was the sound of a human being in agony. Her hand trembled as she slid the bolt. She opened the door a crack, the wind snatching it from her grasp and slamming it open against the interior wall. He fell inward, collapsing onto the floor in a heap of wet leather and mud. It was him, the face from the poster, though now it was pale and gaunt, a dark beard matted with rain and blood. His eyes, a startlingly intense grey, were glazed with fever. A dark, ugly stain was spreading across his left side, soaking his duster and the rough-spun shirt beneath. She slammed the door shut, bolting it against the storm and whatever demons were chasing this man. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. For a long minute, Abigail stood frozen, the shotgun still clutched in her hands, her mind a whirlwind of terror and indecision. The law her own safety, the posters in town they all screamed at her to throw him back out into the storm. Let the wolves or the Pinkertons have him. But then she looked at his face. The hardness she'd seen in the poster's sketch was softened by pain. He looked younger than she'd expected, and she saw the raw, desperate humanity of a man at the end of his rope. It was the same desperation she saw in her own reflection every morning. And there was Thomas, asleep in the next room. What kind of woman would she be if she let a man die on her doorstep, no matter what he'd done? What kind of lesson would that teach her son? With a sob of frustration and fear, she laid the shotgun on the table. She knelt beside him, the metallic smell of his blood sharp in the air. This was madness. She was inviting death into her home, inviting the wrath of men far more powerful and pitiless than this half-dead outlaw. But as she touched his feverish forehead, she knew she had no other choice. She was already a widow haunted by death. She would not become a woman haunted by her own conscience. Abigail Hayes, a woman who had prayed for a miracle, had just sheltered the devil. And as the storm raged outside, she began the painstaking work of saving his life, completely unaware that she was forfeiting her own. The first 48 hours were a fever dream. Abigail worked with a grim, focused determination she hadn't felt since Robert's final days. She dragged Jedediah Stone to the small cot in the corner of the main room, grunting with the effort. He was lean but corded with muscle, a man built for a hard life. With trembling hands, she cut away his blood-soaked shirt. The wound was ugly, a deep, ragged tear in his side, where a bullet had gouged a path through flesh. It was inflamed and hot to the touch. It needed cleaning, and it needed stitching. She boiled water, her movements automatic, her mind a numb buzz of fear. She poured whiskey from a closely guarded bottle over the wound, earning a choked gasp from the unconscious man, and then using her finest sewing needle and thread, she began to close the wound. Each stitch was a prayer and a curse. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering names she didn't know. Cassie, Blackwood, the Cimarron. His grey eyes clouded with delirium. During his brief moments of lucidity, he didn't fight her. He simply watched her with an unnerving intensity, as if memorizing her face. On the third morning, the fever broke. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. Abigail was outside feeding her few scrawny chickens when she heard a voice from the doorway. "You should have left me to die." She turned. He was standing, leaning heavily against the doorframe, pale and gaunt, but undeniably alive. His grey eyes were clear, now sharp and assessing. He wasn't just an outlaw anymore. He was a man, and the force of his presence was unsettling. "It wasn't my place to decide," she said, her voice steady, despite the hammering in her chest. She walked back towards the house, keeping a cautious distance. "The good book says, the good book didn't get this bullet put in me." He cut her off, his voice a low rasp. "And it won't stop the men who did from coming back. You've put yourself and that boy of yours in the line of fire." He knew about Thomas. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. "My son's name is Thomas," she said coolly, "and you'll not speak of him." A flicker of something respect perhaps crossed his face. "Fair enough. My name is Jedediah. I know who you are. Your face is on every wall in Redemption Creek." He gave a humorless smile. "Then you know you're harboring a killer." The word hung in the air between them. Abigail looked at this man, at the way his hand rested near the Colt peacemaker he'd had tucked in his belt, a gun she had unloaded and hidden away. She thought of the whispers in town, of the murdered deputy Franklin Potts, a young man with a new wife. "Did you do it?" she asked, the question escaping her before she could stop it. "Did you kill him?" Jedediah's gaze didn't waver. It was like looking into a deep, cold well. "I've done things in my life I ain't proud of, Mom. Things that'll weigh on my soul till Judgment Day. But I didn't kill that deputy. He was dead before I ever got to that train car." She didn't know if she believed him. Outlaws were liars by trade. But there was a stark sincerity in his voice that chipped away at her certainty. The days that followed fell into a strange, tense rhythm. Jedediah, or Jed as he told her to call him, stayed out of sight, mostly resting in the small, rickety barn. He was a quiet patient, grimly focused on healing. He never complained, never asked for more than she offered. He spent hours cleaning his pistol with a slow, methodical care that was almost hypnotic. Thomas was her biggest challenge. He was a curious boy, and he knew something was wrong. "Who's the man in the barn, Mama?" he asked one evening, his blue eyes wide and serious. Abigail's heart seized. "Just a drifter. I'm letting him mend a hurt ankle before he moves on." It was a weak lie, and she knew Thomas didn't fully believe it, but the boy was accustomed to the hard silences of their life. He didn't press her. Instead, he started finding excuses to be near the barn. One afternoon, Abigail came out to find Jed sitting on a hay bale, showing Thomas how to carve a piece of scrap wood into a small, remarkably detailed horse. The sight stopped her in her tracks. There was a gentleness in the outlaw's large, calloused hands, a patience in his voice as he spoke to her son that she couldn't reconcile with the face on the wanted poster. Thomas was smiling, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his small face. "He's a good boy," Jed said later that evening, as Abigail brought him a plate of beans and stale cornbread. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the darkening plains. Strong, like his mother. The unexpected compliment flustered her. "We do what we must to survive. Most folks just do what's easy," he countered, finally turning his grey eyes on her. "It wasn't easy taking me in. It was brave, or foolish. Haven't decided which." "Neither have I," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. A strange connection began to weave itself between them in the quiet moments. He would tell her small things about his life, not about the robbing or the running, but about growing up in the mountains of Colorado, about the feel of a good horse under him, about the stars in a sky untouched by city lights. He spoke with a quiet intelligence that surprised her. He was more than the brute the law made him out to be. In turn, she found herself talking about Robert, about their dreams of building the ranch, about the crushing loneliness that had consumed her since his death. She spoke of her fear of Silas Blackwood, of the foreclosure notice that felt like a death sentence hanging over her. She spoke to this wanted outlaw with a frankness she hadn't used with anyone because he, like her, lived on the edge of a cliff. He understood desperation. One evening, he noticed her rubbing her temples, a deep line of pain creasing her brow. "Headache?" he asked. She nodded. "It's the worry." He stood up and walked over to her. She instinctively tensed, but he simply placed his large thumbs on her temples and began to massage them in slow, firm circles. His touch was surprisingly gentle. It wasn't improper or forward. It was simply a human gesture of comfort. The tension in her skull began to ebb away, replaced by a warmth that spread down her neck and into her shoulders. She closed her eyes, allowing herself this small, forbidden comfort. When he stopped, she opened her eyes. He was standing very close, his gaze intense. The air between them crackled with an unspoken energy. For the first time, she wasn't looking at an outlaw or a patient. She was looking at a man who saw her not just as a widow or a mother, but as a woman. He took a half-step back, breaking the spell. "You're a good woman, Abigail Hayes," he said softly. "You deserve better than this." He turned and walked back into the shadows of the barn, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding, a frantic, treacherous rhythm against her ribs. The sanctuary she had built for him was becoming fragile, not because of the lawmen who might find him, but because of the feelings taking root within its walls. She was sheltering a wanted man, and worse, she was starting to forget why she should be afraid of him. The arrival of Marshal Caleb Thorne in Redemption Creek was an event. He rode in, not on a dusty trail horse, but on a powerful black stallion that seemed to exude the same air of implacable authority as its rider. Thorne was a man carved from granite, with a square jaw, eyes the color of a winter sky, and a reputation that preceded him by 100 miles. He wasn't a local lawman content with settling saloon brawls. He was a U.S. Marshal, a man who hunted other men for a living and rarely failed to bring them in one way or another. He had come for Jedediah Stone. The news reached Abigail via Mrs. Gable, the town's foremost purveyor of gossip, when Abigail made her weekly, nerve-wracking trip into town for supplies. "Rode in yesterday," Mrs. Gable chirped, weighing out a meager portion of flour. "Says he's got a lead that Stone was seen heading this way. Imagine a cold-blooded killer right here in our midst. They say he tracked the Comanche kid all the way to the Mexican border. Never gives up that one." Every word was a hammer blow to Abigail's composure. She paid for her flour and salt, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked the coins back into her purse. She could feel the marshal's presence blanketing the small town, a palpable sense of scrutiny. Men walked a little straighter, spoke a little softer. Even the air seemed charged. When she returned to the ranch, she found Jed in the barn, honing a knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "A U.S. Marshal is in town," she said, her voice tight. "His name is Caleb Thorne. He's hunting you." Jed didn't stop sharpening the blade. His movements remained steady, deliberate. "I know the name. He's a bulldog. Once he gets the scent, he don't let go." He looked up, his grey eyes meeting hers. "You should turn me in, Abigail. Tell him I forced my way in here, threatened you and the boy. He'll believe it. You can take the reward money and be free of this." The offer was a cold splash of reality. It was the sensible path, the safe path. A week ago, she might have considered it. But now the thought of betraying him felt like a physical sickness. "No," she said more forcefully than she intended. "I'll not have that on my conscience." His hands stilled. He stared at her for a long moment, a complex emotion swirling in his eyes. "You're a stubborn woman." "I'm a desperate one," she corrected. "There's a difference." 2 days later, the marshal's shadow fell across her doorstep. Abigail saw him coming from a long way, off a solitary rider on a black horse, moving with an unhurried pace that was more menacing than any gallop. Her stomach twisted into a knot. Jed was in the barn, hidden in the small, cramped hayloft. Thomas was down by the creek a safe distance away. She was alone. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and stood on the porch waiting. She had to appear calm, unassuming, a simple widow minding her own affairs. He reined in his horse, dismounting with fluid grace. He was taller up close, his duster failing to conceal the broadness of his shoulders. He removed his hat, revealing a thick crop of dark hair, and his blue eyes surveyed her, the house, the barn, the entire property, with a sweeping, comprehensive glance that missed nothing. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a deep, steady baritone. "Marshal Caleb Thorne. Apologies for the intrusion." "Marshal," Abigail replied, nodding her head, praying her voice didn't betray her terror. "What can I do for you?" "Just making my rounds, ma'am. I'm looking for a fugitive, man by the name of Jedediah Stone. You may have seen the posters." "I have," she said. "A terrible business what happened to that deputy." "It was—" Thorne agreed, his eyes never leaving her face. He was searching for any flicker of deceit, any hint of a lie. "We have reason to believe he came through this area about a week ago wounded. He'd be looking for a place to lie low, an isolated place. Like this one." The accusation was unspoken, but clear. Abigail forced a weary, bitter laugh. "Marshal, with all due respect, I'm a widow trying to keep my son fed and a roof over our heads. The last thing I'd do is invite a wanted man into my home. I'd be the first to turn him in for that reward money." She hated the words as she said them, the way they tasted like ash in her mouth. She was lying to a federal marshal, a crime in itself. From the barn, she knew Jed was listening, hearing her deny him, hearing her talk about the reward. Thorne's gaze drifted towards the barn. "Mind if I take a look around, just to be thorough?" "Of course," she said, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "There's not much to see. A few chickens, a half-empty hayloft." She walked with him, her legs feeling like lead. Every step was an agony of suspense. He moved with the quiet confidence of a predator. He peered into the chicken coop, checked the small well. Then he stood before the barn doors. "My late husband built this barn," she said, trying to fill the silence to distract him. "Built it with his own 2 hands." Thorne nodded, but his focus was absolute. He slid the heavy wooden door open, and a shaft of dusty sunlight pierced the gloom within. Abigail held her breath. The barn smelled of hay and dry earth. It was quiet. Too quiet. He stepped inside, his boots echoing on the packed dirt floor. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow. He looked at the empty horse stall. His gaze lifted slowly, inexorably towards the hayloft. Abigail's mind raced. Jed was up there, likely holding his breath, his pistol in his hand. If Thorne went up that ladder, blood would be shed. Her blood, the marshal's, Jed's, and it would all be her fault. "Marshal," she said quickly, her voice a little too high. "I don't mean to rush you, but my son will be back from the creek soon. I don't like for him to be around all this unpleasantness." Thorne looked from the ladder back to her. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the faint sheen of sweat on her brow. She knew he saw it. But what would he make of it? A woman's fear of a lawman and his grim work, or the lie of a guilty accomplice? He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching, until Abigail thought she would scream. Then he gave a slow nod. "Of course, ma'am." "I understand." He turned and walked out of the barn back into the bright sunlight. Abigail followed, her knees weak with relief. He put his hat back on, his expression unreadable. "You and your boy are all alone out here. It's a hard life." "We manage," she said softly. "If you see or hear anything," he said, handing her a small card, "anything at all, you send word to me at the hotel in town. Don't try to be a hero. Jedediah Stone is dangerous. more dangerous than you can imagine." He tipped his hat, mounted his stallion, and rode away, never once looking back. Abigail stood on the porch, watching until he was a small speck on the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to sag against the post, her body shaking uncontrollably. She had stared into the eyes of the law and survived. A moment later, Jed emerged from the barn, his face a grim mask. "He knows," Jed said, his voice flat. "He saw nothing," she insisted, trying to convince herself as much as him. "A man like that doesn't need to see," Jed countered, his grey eyes dark with certainty. "He feels. He smelled the lie on you, Abigail. He's not done with us. He's just letting the rope play out. Sooner or later he'll pull it tight." The relief she had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a cold dread. The marshal's shadow had passed over them, but it hadn't gone away. It was just waiting for the right moment to fall again. The marshal's visit changed everything. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered, replaced by a humming, ever-present tension. Jedediah grew more restless, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The ranch no longer felt like a haven. It felt like a trap, and they were the bait. "I need to leave," Jed announced one evening a week after Thorne's visit. He was almost fully healed, the stiffness in his side, the only reminder of the bullet. "Every day I stay here, I put you and Thomas in more danger. Thorne won't stay patient forever." Abigail's heart sank. A part of her, the sensible part, knew he was right, but another more foolish part had grown accustomed to his presence. He had filled the echoing silence of the house. His quiet conversations, his patient way with Thomas, the shared understanding of desperation, it had become a strange sort of comfort. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Mexico, maybe, or north to the mountains. Someplace a man can disappear." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "I owe you my life, Abigail. I don't have money to repay you, but I can give you the truth. You deserve that much." They sat at the pine table, the lantern casting long dancing shadows on the walls. Thomas was asleep. The world was reduced to this small, quiet room, and the heavy weight of unspoken things between them. "The train robbery," he began, his voice low. "It wasn't about the money. Not for me. It was about a ledger, a book of accounts kept by the railroad manager. Silas Blackwood." Abigail stiffened at the name. The banker. The man who held the deed to her ranch. The man who was slowly strangling the life out of her. "What does Blackwood have to do with you?" she asked. "Everything," Jed said, a bitter edge to his voice. "Before all this, I had a partner. We worked a claim up in the San Juans. We struck a rich vein of silver enough to set us up for life. But a claim's no good without a legal title, and Silas Blackwood, through his railroad company, owned all the mineral rights in that valley. He found out about our strike and used his lawyers and his bought-off judges to seize our claim. Left us with nothing." He leaned forward, his grey eyes burning with an old injustice. "But we had proof of his corruption. He was using the railroad to run illegal guns, smuggling them to factions down in Mexico, skimming profits, cheating investors. My partner was the one who kept the books. He knew where all the bodies were buried, so to speak. He kept a secret ledger, a copy of all of Blackwood's dirty dealings." "So you robbed the train to get this ledger?" "Blackwood was shipping his official records to Santa Fe," Jed confirmed. "We figured our copy, our proof, was hidden among them. The plan was to get that book and use it to ruin him, to get back what was ours. It wasn't supposed to be violent. Just get the book and disappear." He fell silent, his jaw tightening. The memory was clearly a painful one. "What happened?" Abigail prompted gently. "It was a setup," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Blackwood knew we were coming. He had Pinkertons waiting on that train along with Deputy Potts. A firefight broke out before we even got to the strongbox. I was hit. I saw Potts go down, but I swear to you, Abigail, it wasn't my bullet. In the chaos, my partner, he vanished. He took the strongbox and left me there to die. A cold, sick feeling began to pool in Abigail's stomach. She felt a premonition, a terrible certainty of what he was about to say. He set me up. Jed continued, his voice laced with a raw, aching betrayal. He made a deal with Blackwood. He'd deliver me to the law, take the blame for the whole thing, and in return, Blackwood would give him a cut and a clean slate. My partner left me bleeding in a ditch and rode off to start his new life. He finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of grief and anger. I'm telling you this because you need to understand who you're dealing with when it comes to Blackwood. He's a snake who'll devour anyone to get what he wants, and he knows how to find a man's weakness, how to turn brother against brother. Abigail sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap. The story was terrible, a litany of greed and betrayal. But one question hammered at the inside of her skull, a question she was terrified to ask. Your partner, she said, her voice a dry, cracking sound. What was his name? Jedediah Stone looked at her, and for the first time she saw not a hardened outlaw, but a man deeply wounded. His grey eyes held a profound sadness. His name, he said slowly, each word a stone dropping into a deep well, was Robert Hayes. The world tilted. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. Robert. Her Robert. The kind, hard-working man she had loved and mourned. The father of her child. It wasn't possible. It was a cruel lie, a trick by a desperate outlaw to save his own skin. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, you're lying. Robert died of a fever. I was with him. I held his hand as he passed. I'm sure you did, Jed said, his voice softening with a pity that she hated. Blackwood is thorough. Robert probably got his clean slate and a bit of cash enough to settle down here and look like an honest rancher. But a man like Blackwood doesn't leave loose ends. A year later, once the heat was off me, and everyone thought I was the sole culprit, Robert comes down with a sudden fever, a fever that no one else in town caught. Don't you find that convenient? The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Robert's sudden arrival in the territory, with a surprising amount of money enough for the down payment on the ranch, his secretive nature about his past, his unexplained trips, supposedly to trade cattle. The way he had always spoken of Silas Blackwood with a mixture of fear and resentment. And the ledger. If Robert had it, where was it? Why would he keep something so dangerous? He wouldn't... She stammered, tears blurring her vision. He loved me. He loved Thomas. He wouldn't do that to us. He wouldn't betray his friend. Greed makes a man do things he'd never imagine, Jed said quietly. Blackwood probably promised him the world. And Robert, he took the deal. The ledger is the only thing that proves my innocence. It's the reason Blackwood wants me dead so badly, and it's likely hidden somewhere on this ranch. Abigail stared at him, her entire world shattered. The man she had married, the memory she had cherished, was a lie. Her grief was a lie. Her husband hadn't been a victim of fate. He had been a traitor. And this man, this outlaw, this supposed killer she had taken in, he was the one who had been wronged. She stood up, knocking her chair over. She stumbled back away from him, away from the terrible, poisonous truth he had just given her. "Get out!" she choked out, wrapping her arms around herself. "Get out of my house!" Jed stood as well, his face etched with a deep, sorrowful understanding. He didn't argue. He simply nodded. "I'll be gone by morning," he said. He walked to the door and paused, turning back to her one last time. "Abigail, I am truly sorry." He stepped out into the night, leaving her alone in the wreckage of her life. She sank to the floor, the sound of her own sobs lost in the vast, unforgiving silence of the prairie. The truth hadn't set her free. It had imprisoned her in a past she no longer recognized and chained her to a future she couldn't begin to imagine. Jedediah was true to his word. By dawn, he was gone. Abigail found the barn empty, the only sign of his presence, a small, perfectly carved wooden horse left on the cot where he had slept. It was for Thomas. The gesture was a small, sharp pain in her chest. The days that followed were a blur of numb, agonizing work. Abigail threw herself into her chores, trying to sweat out the poison of Jed's revelation. Every corner of the ranch was now tainted. The table Robert built, the fence he mended, the very ground she walked on it, was all built on a foundation of betrayal. She was the widow of a man who had sold his partner for a pittance, and then likely paid for it with his life. Silas Blackwood wasn't just her banker. He was the architect of her ruin. The ledger became an obsession. She searched the small house from top to bottom, prying up loose floorboards, checking behind the fieldstone fireplace, emptying every crate and drawer. She found nothing. She moved to the barn, turning over hay bales, digging in the dirt floor, until her fingers were raw. The book remained elusive. Robert had hidden it well. Her desperation mounted. Marshall Thorne was a constant, unnerving presence in town. She saw him watching her when she bought supplies, his cold blue eyes following her every move. He hadn't made another visit, but she felt his suspicion like a physical weight. He was waiting. The breaking point came a week after Jed's departure. 2 men rode up to the ranch. They weren't lawmen. They were hard-faced men with guns worn low on their hips and cruel, dismissive eyes. They worked for Blackwood. She had seen them flanking him in town. The leader, a burly man with a scar that split his left eyebrow, was named Cutter. "Mrs. Hayes," Cutter said, not bothering to dismount. His voice was oily. "Mr. Blackwood sends his regards. He's grown impatient about your husband's outstanding debts." "I told him I'd have the money after the harvest." Abigail said, her hand resting on the porch post to steady herself. Cutter chuckled a low, unpleasant sound. "Plans have changed. Mr. Blackwood has reason to believe your husband left behind something of value. Something that could, let's say, settle his account permanently. A book." Abigail's blood ran cold. They knew. Blackwood must have suspected. Robert never destroyed the ledger. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. Cutter swung down from his horse. "Let's not play games. We know the outlaw Stone was here. Thorne's been sniffing around asking questions. Blackwood figures Stone came back for what's his. Now either you give us the book, or we'll have to tear this place apart to find it. And we won't be gentle." He took a step towards the porch. That's when Thomas, who had been hiding behind the door, ran out. "You leave my mama alone." He shouted, his small face a mask of fierce loyalty. He stood between Abigail and the hired gun, his small fists clenched. Cutter sneered. "Well, look what we have here. A little rooster." He reached out a grimy hand to shove Thomas aside. "Don't you touch him!" Abigail screamed, grabbing the boy and pulling him behind her. It was a standoff. 2 armed men against a defenseless woman and her child. The arid plains offered no help, no witnesses. Fear, cold and absolute, washed over Abigail. This was how it ended. Suddenly a voice cut through the tension, calm and deadly as a gunshot in a silent church. "I'd take your hand off the boy." Everyone turned. Jedediah Stone stood at the corner of the barn, his Colt peacemaker in his hand. He hadn't gone to Mexico. He had been watching, waiting. He moved with a predator's grace, his grey eyes fixed on Cutter, glittering like chips of ice. Cutter and his partner froze their hands, hovering over their own pistols. They were thugs, not gunslingers. They knew the reputation of the man standing before them. "Stone." Cutter spat, trying to sound brave. "Blackwood will pay a fortune for your head." "He can try to collect it himself," Jed said, his voice dropping lower. "You two are going to get on your horses and ride away. You're going to tell Blackwood that Abigail Hayes and her son are under my protection. If I see either of you on this land again, I'll bury you on it." The threat was delivered without heat, a simple statement of fact that made it all the more terrifying. For a long, silent moment, no one moved. Then Cutter slowly, deliberately backed away. He and his partner mounted their horses, their eyes darting nervously between Jed and the open plains. "This ain't over," Cutter snarled. "It will be for you if you don't start riding," Jed replied, raising the barrel of his Colt a fraction of an inch. That was enough. They spurred their horses and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. The silence they left behind was deafening. Thomas ran to Jed, wrapping his arms around the outlaw's legs. "You saved us." Jed flinched slightly at the contact, unused to such open affection. He rested a hand awkwardly on Thomas's head. "Go on inside with your mother, kid." Thomas obeyed, running into the house. Abigail remained on the porch, staring at Jed, her heart a wild mix of terror relief and something else she couldn't name. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "Couldn't leave," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon where the riders had disappeared. Knew Blackwood would make a move once Thorne started asking questions. I figured he'd send his dogs. He walked towards her, holstering his pistol. "He knows the ledger is here, or at least he suspects it is. He won't stop." This was the turning point. All the lies, all the betrayals had led to this moment. She looked at Jed, the man her husband had betrayed, the man who had just risked his life for her and her son. And she made a choice. She was done being a victim. "We have to find it," she said, her voice filled with a new hard resolve. "We have to find that ledger and use it to destroy him." Jed looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He saw the fear was still there, but it was now tempered with steel. He was no longer just protecting a desperate widow. He had found an ally. Where would he hide it? Jed asked. Someplace personal. Someplace you wouldn't think to look. Abigail's mind raced through the possibilities again. The house, the barn. And then it came to her, a memory of Robert late at night, out by the small, lonely patch of ground where they had buried their first child, a daughter stillborn years ago. He had told her he was reinforcing the small grave marker. She had thought it a strange, grief-stricken gesture at the time. His greatest betrayal, she said softly, understanding dawning. He would hide it with his deepest sorrow. She led the way to the small, wind-swept knoll behind the house. A single flat field stone marked the tiny grave. It looked solid, undisturbed. But Jed, examining it closely, found the seams. Using his knife, he pried at the edges. The top layer of stone had been hollowed out and resealed with pitch. He lifted the stone lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a slim, leather-bound book. The ledger. Abigail stared at it, the proof of her husband's treachery, and the key to their survival. As Jed lifted it from its hiding place, the setting sun cast their long shadows across the prairie. They were no longer a widow and an outlaw. They were partners in a desperate war bound together by the sins of a dead man. And the reckoning was just beginning. The ledger felt like a venomous snake in Abigail's hands. As Jed lit the lantern back in the house, she opened it on the table. The pages were filled with Robert's familiar, neat script, a script she had only ever seen on loving letters and household lists. Now it detailed a cold, calculated world of corruption. Dates, shipments, names and numbers filled every page. Coded entries detailed crates of rifles and ammunition listed as mining equipment on the official railroad manifests shipped south. There were notations of payments from Silas Blackwood to territorial judges' land agents, and even a senator's aide. And there on a page near the end was a single entry that made Abigail's breath catch in her throat. Payment to R. Hayes for services rendered J. Stone. $5,000, followed by a second smaller entry, final settlement. It was all there. The proof of Jed's innocence in the murder, the proof of Robert's betrayal, and the evidence to utterly destroy Silas Blackwood. He documented everything, Jed murmured, looking over her shoulder. His voice was grim. He was either a fool, or he planned to use this as insurance against Blackwood one day. He was a coward, Abigail said, her voice flat and empty of emotion. He was afraid of you, and he was afraid of Blackwood. This book was the only power he had. She closed it with a sharp snap. Now it's ours. The dynamic between them shifted. They were no longer hiding from the world. They were planning to confront it. An unholy alliance was forged in the flickering lamplight, the outlaw seeking justice and the widow seeking vengeance. A new energy sparked between them, born not of forbidden romance, but of shared purpose and mutual respect. Blackwood will send more men, Jed stated, pacing the small room. Next time they won't be so easily scared. We can't just sit here and wait for them. So what do we do? Abigail asked. We can't just walk into the marshal's office. He'll arrest you on sight. Thorne, Jed mused, stopping his pacing. He's a hard man, but they say he's an honest one. He believes in the law. What if the law itself is corrupt? What if we could prove it to him? A plan began to form, desperate and dangerous. They couldn't go to the law in Redemption Creek. Blackwood owned the town sheriff and the justice of the peace. They needed a higher authority. Judge Henry Wallace Abigail said suddenly, remembering a name from the ledger. Blackwood paid him off, but the ledger also mentions his rival, a federal judge named Elias Ford in Santa Fe. It says Ford is unmovable and a problem. If he's a problem for Blackwood, he's a friend to us, Jed finished. We need to get this book to Santa Fe, to Judge Ford. The journey to Santa Fe was over 100 miles of open, dangerous territory. Blackwood's men would be watching the roads. Marshal Thorne was still out there hunting. For Abigail and Thomas to simply disappear would raise immediate suspicion. I'll go, Jed said. I can travel faster alone. No, Abigail countered immediately. You're one man. They'll be looking for a lone rider. But a woman and her child on their way to visit family in the city. We'd be less conspicuous. You could travel separately, shadow us. Be our guardian angel. Jed looked at her, his admiration clear. Her mind was sharp, her will unshakable. She had been forged into something new by her grief and betrayal. The decision was made. The next 2 days were a flurry of preparation. Abigail packed their meager belongings into their old buckboard wagon. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Gable, leaving it on the table, speaking of a sudden family emergency that required her to travel to see her sister near Santa Fe. It was a flimsy pretext, but it might buy them time. The night before, they were to leave. A quiet intensity filled the small house. Thomas was asleep, clutching the small wooden horse Jed had carved for him. Abigail and Jed sat in near silence, the weight of the coming danger pressing down on them. You're risking everything, Abigail, Jed said, softly breaking the silence. For me. For a man you should hate. Abigail looked up from the worn dress she was mending. "I'm not doing this for you, Jedediah. Not entirely. I'm doing it for Thomas. I'm doing it so he can grow up on land that is truly ours, not bought with blood money. I'm doing it to reclaim the name my husband soiled." She paused, her needle still. "And I'm doing it because what Blackwood and Robert did to you was wrong. Some things are just right or wrong. It's as simple as that." He moved to sit across from her, his presence filling the small space. He reached out and gently took the mending from her hands, setting it aside. Then he took her hands in his. They were rough and calloused from work, but his touch was surprisingly tender. "Nothing about this is simple," he said, his voice low and husky. His grey eyes searched hers, and in their depths she saw not the hardened killer from the wanted posters, but a man starved of kindness, a man who had known little more than betrayal and violence. She saw his loneliness, and it mirrored her own. The air grew thick, charged with the unspoken emotions that had been building for weeks. He leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. When his lips met hers, it wasn't a kiss of fiery passion, but one of profound, aching tenderness. It was a kiss of shared solitude, of desperate hope. It spoke of gratitude, of partnership, of a future that was terrifyingly uncertain, but for the first time felt possible. She leaned into him, her hands coming up to cup his face, feeling the rough stubble of his beard. The kiss deepened a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, an alliance forged in a storm, and now sealed in the quiet darkness. When they finally broke apart, they simply looked at each other, the truth of their feelings laid bare. "Get some rest, Abigail," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Tomorrow we go to war." He stood and walked to the door, pausing to look back at her, one last time, before melting into the night. Abigail brought her fingers to her lips, the ghost of his kiss still warm on her skin. She had invited the devil in, and somewhere along the way, he had become her salvation. The journey was a wire of tension, and it snapped 30 miles shy of Santa Fe. Marshal Caleb Thorne sat astride his black stallion, blocking the trail like a granite cliff. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice cold iron, "this is the end of the road." Before his deputies could move, a voice echoed from the rocks above. "I'd reconsider that, Marshal." Jedediah stood there, rifle in hand, a ghost made flesh. In the tense standoff that followed, Abigail found her voice. "It's not him you want," she cried, holding up the oilcloth-wrapped ledger. "It's Silas Blackwood. The proof is in here, proof. My husband kept proof that Deputy Potts was killed in a trap set by Blackwood." Jed raised his voice, his aim steady. "Let her and the boy go, Thorne. The warrant is for me. Take me, but let the truth get to Santa Fe." It was a devil's bargain, offering his life for justice. Thorne hesitated, his gaze shifting from the outlaw on the ridge to the desperate woman in the wagon. He dismounted, took the proffered book and scanned its damning pages. His expression hardened as he read of the bribes, the gun-running, the deep rot that implicated men he was sworn to uphold. He made a choice that would redefine his career. Handing the ledger back to Abigail, he said, "Go to Judge Ford. Tell him Marshal Thorne is investigating new evidence and requires his aid." He turned his back on the rocks, a deliberate act of blindness. To his stunned deputies he announced, "Looks like we were delayed by a broken wagon wheel. Let the woman pass." Abigail flicked the reins, her heart hammering with a terrifying, soaring hope. They had gambled on one good man's conscience, and for now they had won. In the wild and unforgiving heart of the West, stories weren't just written in ink. They were etched in dust and blood, in impossible choices and the faint glimmers of redemption. The story of Abigail Hayes and Jedediah Stone wasn't a fairy tale. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest courage is found in the deepest desperation. She was a widow who chose to see the man behind the bounty, and he was an outlaw who found a reason to be a better man. Their journey to Santa Fe was only the beginning of their fight against the corruption that sought to swallow them whole, a fight that would challenge the very foundations of law and justice in the territory. Their story reminds us that heroes and villains are rarely as clear-cut as the faces on a wanted poster. It proves that a home is not just four walls, but the sanctuary you build in another person's trust. What do you think is the true meaning of justice, and can a love born from such a violent beginning ever truly find peace? If this tale of grit, betrayal, and unexpected love captured your heart, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who appreciates a real Western saga, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the untamed frontier. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.